Hey everybody, welcome to the 12th episode of Duke's Download. Today we have a guest who I'm extremely excited to talk to. We've communicated over Instagram for a while, but we've never actually spoken directly. So I'm really excited to have him. Eric Cervini, who is the author of the new New York Times bestselling book, The Deviant's War, and he just sent me a request. So let's go live. It's connecting. Hey there.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Everything's perfect.
Oh, good. I'm so sorry I'm in a car. I wouldn't be a true Angelino if I weren't stuck in traffic. So
No
I'm so
problem.
sorry.
No, actually, I swear to God, I'm just grateful that you're giving me the time. I know your schedule right now is insane with all the promotion.
Yeah, it's
Congratulations.
calming down a little bit, but got away for the weekend and was supposed to be back by 5, but here I am. You may know Adam. So I'm glad.
Congratulations, by the way. New York
Oh,
Times bestseller.
wonderful. Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. No, I was pretty amazed when you posted about the fact that it had gotten to the New York Times bestseller list. That this is the first LGBT history book since, was it Randy Schultz's book and the
It
band?
was Randy Schultz. Yep, exactly. 1993.
Right. Yeah. I mean, as you can tell, I'm a bit of a. I mean, nowhere near your level, but I'm a bit of a LGBT history uh,
Good.
fan myself. So, obviously, I was familiar with his work, and
Yeah.
I think that's something that really, one of the reasons why I followed you for a while is because there aren't many people, especially of our generation, that not only that are interested in LGBT history, but that have taken
hmm
your level and have really made it your cause, your passion in life.
Yeah, and it's one of my dreams is to encourage other people to realize how many other stories are out there and how many stories need to be told still.
Mhm.
I don't think anyone has a monopoly over gay history or queer history, especially within the academia. And I think anyone, if they're interested in queer history, should start doing their own research and start discovering stories and sharing them with the world because anyone can do it. And that's the one thing I want to encourage people to do.
100%. I mean, I'll make one quick point about me, and then I'll talk in your book. But yeah, I mean, for me, like when I first started, understanding who I was and coming out when I was a teenager, it was
Mhm.
learning more about people in history that really made me feel gave me the confidence to be like, okay,
Right,
I'm part of something bigger than myself, and
right.
the more people cannot number one educate themselves, but then also impart that knowledge and wisdom to others.
hmm
That gives other people the confidence to be who they are. So I
Exactly.
think you're doing a lot of good, and you're doing something that's really important right now.
Thank
Uh,
you. Thank you so much.
but so before I talk about the book, I wanted to just ask you, what was your journey in, how did you start getting interested in LGBT history? And then you can talk about, your journey go to Cambridge, Harvard, yeah, and Cambridge. So.
Both of them, yeah. It was very much an accident. I thought I was going to be going to law school. I was studying political science, and was just waiting to eventually become a lawyer and do that world. And then realized as an undergraduate that there was so much of history that I didn't know. And it was that realization, even though, I had taken American history in high school and, a couple classes in college, but then, it was really watching the film Milk, written by Justin Lance Black, who's phenomenal. I was able to talk with him during our tour. And that moment of realizing as a 21 year old that, how do I not know this story? How did I not know the name Harvey Milk, even though it's one of the most unbelievable stories and inspirational and heartbreaking stories of all time? How did I not know this story? And then B, what other stories must be out there?
Mhm.
And so that really was the catalyst for me starting to do a little bit of the initial research into other gay icons and historical figures. And the very first one who I realized there was a hole in the stories that have been written where Frank Kameny, historians have long known that he was the grandfather of the gay rights movement, but there had never been a book written about him. And so, I started thinking, why is there not a book? What is going on? And part of the reason why is because he kept so many of his records throughout his entire life. Every single letter that he sent or ever received, he kept. So hundreds and thousands of documents. It's a very daunting task. And so that's why it ended up taking me 7 years to write this book, because there were just so many materials to have to go through and construct something that, is still long, but at least readable. And so it's been a great process.
Oh, sorry, I didn't interrupt.
No.
He only donated because he passed away, 10 years ago or so?
Yeah, a little less than 10 years ago.
And he didn't donate. What do you know? What year he donated his? It didn't happen until relatively close before he died, right?
Exactly. He started the process around 2005 or 2006. But then, because it was just such a daunting quantity of papers that he donated to the Library of Congress prior to his death, and it's actually how he was able to survive his final years was because he got those documents appraised, and a group of donors, including a nonprofit called the Kameny Papers Project, was able to literally buy them off of him, and he was living really in destitution. And then it took a few more years for them to process them and categorize them and put them in the folders. And so really, I think it was done around 2009, and then I discovered Frank, and I discovered his collection about a year or two after that. So I wish I had the chance to meet him, and it's one of my greatest regrets is that I hadn't discovered him earlier. But I certainly got to know him through other means.
Yeah, and so I think it's interesting that you already had an interest in history and politics. It was only like a little later on that I'm assuming through your own coming out experience and learning about your community, that you sort of the two, and that your interest turned into something more specific to LGBT, kind of like me, and that I was already interested in politics when I was a kid.
Right.
Came out, it was like my interest in politics melded with my own sort of identity and interest in my own community,
Right.
But so regarding Frank Kameny, so he was also a alum of, if that's the correct term, of Harvard as well, right?
Yes, yeah. So he went there. He's originally from New York City. For people who don't know who Frank Kameny is,
that's sort of part of the interest that he went to the same college as you did.
Yeah, well, he got his PhD there, so I went there for undergrad, but he spent much more time there because he got his PhD and was there for something like 7 or 8 years. And so if people don't know who he is, he got his PhD in astronomy in 1956, which is the year before the launch of Sputnik, the Russian satellite that really launched the space race and the beginning of, the race to the moon and to outer space. So he was an astronomer. There were only a couple dozen of them. Probably one of the most in-demand professions in the entire world. And he was, positioned to be creating NASA, the human space flight program in America. And then the government, as soon as he started working for the Defense Department, the government found out that he was gay. And so they said, we don't care about your talents. We don't care about your Harvard education or your decades of training to help us construct our space program. You have no place in the federal government. So he was never allowed, after the government fired him in 1957, he wasn't allowed to work for the federal government ever again for the rest of his life. And so, the story that my book tells is how he was really the first to fight back. Because usually if this happened, and it happened, in the 1950s, at the rate of 1,000 people were purged for sexual deviance, as it was called, through every single year throughout the 1950s. And he was the first one to fight back, because usually if you get fired, then you don't want to make a big deal of it, right? You want to just kind of move on, maybe move to a new city, carry on with your life. But he said, screw that. This is wrong. you're ruining my life, and I'm going to fight back all the way to the top. So a lot of people have heard about the Supreme Court decision that came out this past week. He was the first one to ever petition the Supreme Court for the employment rights of sexual deviants, of gays or queers. So we really, really owe all the rights that we're achieving now in our current struggle to Frank.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, I'm about halfway through your book. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but
I don't blame you. It takes a while. It's a long book. Take your time.
Incredible. It's incredible. And so far, I mean, and I consider myself, as I've already said, a self-proclaimed like gay history fan. There's stuff I didn't know about him, and I mean, like incredible stuff, like the fact that he was organizing demonstrations outside the White House in the late 50s or early 60s, regarding gay rights. I mean, that right there is something that I think most people would probably think is unfathomable. That
exactly.
That he was that vocal and coined the term "gay is good." That it became sort of a whatever the term is, a mantra or
yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I mean that right there I think is incredible. And then what was his? Because I knew what the Madison Society was, but I didn't realize that he was actually one of the first people that was involved in that. Is that right?
Yes. So there's really, when you hear the name Madison Society, for people who don't know, it was really the first national gay rights organization in America. And it was actually originally started right here in Los Angeles in 1950 by a group of communists who said, hey, Karl Marx is saying that workers are a minority that don't know that they're a minority group. And if only they bound together and fought back and recognized their status as a minority group, then maybe they could create a revolution. So this group of guys, including Harry Hay, his name's a little bit more familiar to people, said, hey, wait a second, maybe gays are just like workers in that they are an unknown minority group that is oppressed, and if we bound together, then we could fight back. The problem was, then once they started this new organization called the Madison Society, they realized, and the members of the Madison Society realized, that it's probably not a good idea to be in the middle of the McCarthy era to be filled with communists. So there was really, they started organizing their own purges and saying, oh, we need to get rid of all the communists in our gay organization because that's going to make us look bad. So there was kind of some historians call it a retreat to respectability. So instead of fighting for revolution and for social change, it became much more about assimilation. They would organize blood drives trying to prove we're just as good as you. We're gays are just as normal as straights. And Frank Kameny was the one who really reclaimed that original purpose and militancy, and saying, screw that. I'm not going to just try to prove that I'm just like a straight person. You can take me how I am. And, well, I don't, it doesn't matter who I sleep with. You should be hiring me because I'm the best astronomer in my field. And so that's why he was the first to go to the Supreme Court, first to, as you said, picket outside the White House, all these incredible feats that everyone needs to know. And this was all happening a decade before Stonewall.
Yep. No, absolutely. And I knew about his fight in terms of protections in the workplace and federal employees, but I also didn't know that he was the first openly gay member or candidate for Congress in 1971. And also, I had no idea about, that he was involved in the American Psychological Association overturning their designation of homosexuality as a mental illness.
Yes. And I should warn people that the book really just talks about that first battle. And the very last chapter is in 1971. It's called The Candidate, and it's about that run for Congress. As you said, he was the first openly gay American to run for Congress. And after that moment is when his organization, the Madison Society, really stopped working through them and instead pivoted more to the fight for removing homosexuality as a mental illness through the American Psychiatric Association. And so that really is a story for the sequel, is that entire saga. There's a documentary actually coming up by some friends and colleagues of mine that I'm very excited about, called Cured, which actually details that entire fight. But there's certainly room for more. I mean, this book just covers the 1960s. You know, there should be one on the 70s. There should be one on the 80s. There's so much room for Frank Kameny.
Wow. I mean, it's pretty mind blowing that he was involved in so many seminal moments in the history of the movement, and yet, if to the extent people are aware of him, it is usually only, like, even for me, it was only based on that particular issue of employment and, you know,
Right.
or federal protections for workers and all of that. And another way that he was an important figure was in the fight to allow gays in the military. That he worked
Mm-hmm.
with Leonard Matlovich, who's another
Yes.
becomes sort of obscure that people don't know about. Who was just for those who don't know, he was the guy that was on the cover of Time magazine as an openly gay soldier in the mid 70s, and said, you
Yep.
know, I think his quote was, I was discharged for, I received a medal for killing 2 men and a discharge for loving one.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
It's on his gravestone.
In his own right.
Yeah.
And yet kind of written out of history or ignored.
Absolutely. And with Matlovich and so many other figures who were the ones who fought back in the 70s, in the 80s, because even after Frank was successful in overturning some of the Civil Service Commission and civilian policies in the 70s, in the FBI, in, you know, the CIA, obviously in the military, the gay purges continued. They still continue now with trans Americans who are not able to fight for their own country, right? And what's so important about Frank is he created that template for how to fight back, right? So if you were someone in the 80s, for example, you were working for the FBI and they found out you were gay, and you get fired, who do you call? You call Frank Kameny. So he was the one who really trains people like Leonard Matlovich, and later other people within some of the more secretive, sensitive parts of the government, and saying, here's how you fight. This is how it's done. And he really laid the groundwork, not just for gay pride, not just for protest or working through the courts, but for a whole generation after generation after generation of resistance. So we really owe everything, among other people, to Frank.
Yeah, I read that that Leonard read about Frank in a magazine or in a book, and he said, you know, that Frank had already been working on the issue of gays in the military, and that he reached out to him and said, you know, I'd love to help, and that
Right.
he sort of, I think, voluntarily or intentionally announced that he was gay to his superior and got fired, and that created a chain reaction. And yeah, something that you mentioned before that I read about in the first few pages of your book is the idea that in the 40s and 50s there was already a gay culture, in terms of gay parties, gay clubs. I mean, not clubs, but gay establishments.
Basically, yeah.
And that so there was a cultural and social sense of identity, but it was only through like the Madison Society and people like Frank that they realized, okay, well, what we need to do if we want to win acceptance and legal equality, we need to create a political identity in terms of a movement. And that concept hadn't really existed before, except in the context of labor movement or the
Right.
rights movement. So it was really his idea to sort of say, okay, this isn't just and Larry Kramer later sort of had the same sort of idea that being gay can't just be a sexual or cultural identity. It has to be a political identity as well.
Right.
And so I think that's something that I thought was really fascinating, that Frank sort of created that concept of a political movement.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned gay bars and really clubs. A lot of people think, oh, there couldn't have been gay bars before Stonewall. And then you look and you do the research and you realize there were a few dozen gay bars in each major city in the 1950s, right? Like, it's unbelievable how vibrant the gay world was. So many historians have done great work. Jenny Beeman in D.C. wrote The Queer Capital. George Chauncey in New York wrote Gay New York, looking at how these diverse gay worlds existed, but as you pointed out, they weren't mobilized. They weren't fighting quite yet. And so what was so remarkable about what Harry Hay did, what Madison did, and then what Frank Kameny did, was mobilizing people who were already, it wasn't like they were just completely secretive and closeted and, not living their lives. People were living very vibrant gay lives, of course, underground, perhaps more invisible than than it is now. But he was the one who kind of shook them by the shoulders and said, "Hey, we need to be fighting and be more visible." And that's really how the biggest contribution I think that my book makes is that's pride, right? That idea of gay pride is something that did not exist until Frank Kameny, until he wrote his 1961 Supreme Court document saying, not only is being gay not a bad thing, which is what the government was saying, he said, it's a really good thing. This is a moral good. And I'm going to say that publicly. I'm going to make that claim, which is just as arbitrary as what the government was saying. I'm going to make that claim in public. Those are the two parts of pride. And so that was 1961, a full decade before Stonewall. So, just as you said, it was that political mobilization that we can really thank Frank for.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of laughed actually, because in the part of the book where you said when he moved to Tucson, you described like the vibrant gay, under whatever specific term you use, but the vibrant gay scene in Tucson. I was like, wait a second, there was a vibrant gay scene.
Yeah. Exactly, because right now, where are the gay bars, right? Like, where are these places? Of course, online, any city is probably vibrant, but back then, before Grindr or Tinder or Facebook or Instagram, the only place where you could meet people were via gay bars, and of course, they would never advertise themselves as gay bars, but they were, right? I mean, they were predominantly patronized by gay men and women. And so, yeah, it's shocking to see how incredibly vibrant it was, and also the effects of the internet and also openness and assimilation. How those have affected those gay worlds. So it's a very complex process, but it raises a lot of questions now, as gay bars are opening back up, and some of them aren't. What is the future for our own gay worlds? So it's certainly an interesting trend.
Oh yeah, I mean, Boston, when you talked about how many different gay bars and establishments there were there, even that was surprising. But I thought, okay, Boston, like, I mean, back then it was pretty incredible. But even more incredible in a place like Arizona. Like, I thought, wait a second, like, and I thought, how did people even begin? Where did you even begin to try to find, the gay underground at that time? I was thinking, like, where would you even begin to try to find that? But anyway, I thought that is a really fascinating part of the book.
Well, that's a good question, but it's like, what do you do now? If you go to a new city, you don't know anyone, and you want to connect to the gay world, what do? Well, you pull out your phone. Yeah. Maybe you'll go to a gay bar, but like, chances are, if you're going to Tucson, you're not going to just like show up at a gay bar. You pull up your phone, you go on to Grindr, you go on to Tinder, you like start asking questions, you meet people. Back then, in the beginning, all the way at the beginning of the 20th century, you go to a park, right? You go to a cruising ground. Same exact thing. Instead of Grindr, you would go to in DC, you would go to Lafayette Park, or you would go to DuPont Circle, and you sit down at a bench and you wait, and you cross your legs, and you wait for a guy to come up and talk to you. And then you ask, well, what's the situation in this city? And so all these kind of norms that we think are so new, we think like cruising online and anonymous sex is a new thing. No, this has been around for centuries, literally.
Unbelievable. Yeah. It was pretty amazing to read, fascinating. And one thing I thought was funny. I thought the timing of the release of your book is so funny, considering it literally came out either the week before or the week of the Supreme Court ruling. And I know you said in one of your posts that you'd have to update the epilogue of your book. It's literally now. I mean, okay, this Supreme Court decision did not encompass housing and a lot of elements, and so the Equality Act is still super important. But in terms of the employment protections, this week the Supreme Court finally enshrined into law what Frank Kameny had been fighting for
Exactly.
his entire life.
Exactly. Right. And it's, so many people think of this as like a new fight or a new development. And really, as we talked about, this is really the culmination of his 60-year battle, right? Beginning all the way in 1957. But then you also have to look, and a big part of my book is looking at who is forgotten, right? We can tell the story of Frank's battle, and his many successes, but you also have to tell the story of, why was his organization all white? Where were the gender nonconforming people? Who were also on the front lines at Stonewall and afterwards? Why wasn't his organization also fighting for them? And just like right now, yes, we should be celebrating, but also we need to be asking ourselves, who are we forgetting, right? Whether it's trans Americans, whether it's Black trans women who are being killed like clockwork every 2 weeks. These are the conversations that we need to be having. Yes, we should celebrate, but we need to be vigilant also of saying, all right, yes, we have made it. We have marriage. We now have employment, anti-discrimination, law of the land. Who are we forgetting, and who do we have a moral obligation to be fighting for now? Because now that we have even more privileges after last week, this is our moment to actually, I think, make up for a lot of the failures that our community has made over the past 60 years as well.
Yeah, the point you made, which I never thought about it in this sort of framing before, but the fact that this decision last week was literally a direct result of the Civil Rights Act, which was passed and fought for by the Black civil rights leaders, by people like, whether it was Martin Luther King or Bayard Rustin, who's another person who's been sort of, ignored, for a long stretch of time in terms of contributions to the gay rights movement.
Yep.
And so I thought that was such an interesting way to look at it, that literally we are now, as gay and as LGBTQ people, benefiting directly from the work that was done 60 years ago by the Black freedom movement.
And the even crazier part, which is something I wish I had been able to talk to when I was like on Anderson Cooper and stuff that I didn't have time to talk about, is yes, the 1964 Civil Rights Bill was a result of Bayard Rustin and the 1963 March on Washington, but Title VII, and specifically protection of sex, was not supposed to be in the bill. Protection of sex-based discrimination, preventing that, was added onto the bill in order to annihilate the bill by Southern racist segregationists, because they believed if they added sex to the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, that no one would vote for it. And miraculously, it was added in because there was enough support, but that was added in by a senator from Virginia trying to sink the bill. And so we're literally benefiting, gays are literally benefiting from, the crazy tactics of Southern racist segregationists. So I think that kind of tells us like why we need to be going the extra mile right now.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if you had told those senators back then, years later, homosexuals and transgender people would be protected under federal law.
Nightmare.
Their heads would explode.
Yeah.
I always thought it was funny, like, how if you had told Ronald Reagan in 1988 that his appointment to the Supreme Court would be the one that wrote the ruling in favor of enshrining marriage equality on the land, his mind would explode. And that's why I think history is so fascinating, because you never, when you can look at it over sort of the big picture, you realize how certain decisions and certain things that happened in history are still having an impact, and still sort of, I'm sure, I mean, obviously it was relatively recent, but if you had told Donald Trump 3 years ago that his appointee to the Supreme Court would be the guy that wrote the majority ruling to protect LGBT people against federal, employment discrimination, he wouldn't have thought that either. So,
and he's pissed, right? Like it's going to be in his platform for 2020 of rolling these back, right? Of removing these protections. It's going to be in the platform, and frankly, I'm glad, because now we can point to the people who love us and say that they support us and say, if you really support, if you vote for this man, that is a direct attack upon me, and you are hurting me as an individual, and you cannot claim to love me as your nephew, as your son, as your friend if you support this man. On top of all the egregious, racist, transphobic, complete horrific nature of this administration. So, I think at least we now have the ability to say, all right, let's keep fighting.
Absolutely. And speaking of keeping the fight going, obviously I know you've been really busy with promotion for the book, but I know you also, by the way, anyone that doesn't already follow Eric, please do, because he has amazing posts about LGBT history, and I love the podcast that you started, good as well. But so are there, I know you probably haven't had a chance to think, but are there other projects that you're already thinking about or working on?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've had so much fun doing on social media, kind of as experimentation, is going even farther back in time and looking at, whether it's medieval era or ancient Greece, and trying to make history as accessible as possible. And of course, we both live in Los Angeles, the home of Hollywood. And I think, it's my mission to make queer history especially as accessible, entertaining, and informative and empowering as possible. And so I'm going to keep experimenting. We also have a couple other events this week with Representative Brian Sims in Philadelphia. He had some trouble in Philly with his own reelection. He just got the results back, and he got the renomination. So we had to reschedule, and so now we have it Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern is when we'll be chatting also about similar concepts, right? Because he's really following in the footsteps of Frank, but also having won his political seat. So I'm so excited to ask him a lot of questions too.
He's great. He's great.
Yeah.
And no, I'm such a big fan of yours and admire what.
Oh, likewise.
I really hope people buy the book. It's incredible. And no, I'm really excited to see where you go, and I think you're doing a lot of good for the world. So
likewise. Well, I can't thank you enough for having me, but also, I've been following your conversations with, whether it's Governor Police or all these incredible conversations that you're having, which is exactly what we need to be doing right now, especially in the middle of a pandemic where it's hard to be having these one-on-one conversations, but more important than ever before, especially in an election year. So thank you, not just for having me, but also for creating this platform. It's so important.
Thank you. I know you're actually the first fellow millennial that I've talked to. Because I thought, and I thought about it, I was like, okay, I need to young it up a little bit, because as great as my guests have been, I had friends even that were saying you realize that every single person you've interviewed has been over the age of 50. And I think it's because, I think you're probably similar in this respect, that because of our interest in politics and history and all that, I don't know, those are people that sometimes I relate to more often than I do people my own age. But so in you, I kind of see a kindred spirit, and that we're both unusual for people of our generation.
Right. And I'll give you my hot take, which is don't stop. I'm so grateful that you have me, but I think that intergenerational conversation is something that's really lacking in popular culture, online, everywhere. It's very easy for us to be tweeting at each other and on Instagram. It's much harder and much rarer for people across generations to be having these sorts of conversations. And that's why I love what you're doing, and keep it going, because you have the platform. And I think for people our age to be learning from our elders and from their successes and also their failures, and having that conversation is so great. So thank you again.
Thank you, Eric.
Awesome.
And congrats, and talk soon, I hope.
Thanks so much. Absolutely. Talk soon. Take care.
Bye.
All right. See ya.
Too.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.